Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Alrighty, guys. Why is it so dark in here on the camera and yet it's not in the room? Lighting will always confuse me. But that's okay. Hi, guys. How are you? Good. Okay, let's do it. Original link, top description. I'd recommend watching the previous episode. That is up to you, though. Copy notes. Did I say my name's Connor? Original link to the video, top of the description. Right below that, link to the Discord. Let's do it. Siege of Tyre.
Alexander wasted no time in enacting his peerless ambition. Not only had he eliminated his enemies at home and defeated the satraps of Asia Minor, but in 333, he confronted and crushed a Persian royal army at the Battle of Issus. With that victory, Midas's proverbial touch fell on the Macedonians, and they began to drown in gold. But although Issus was a crushing victory, it was not decisive. Darius and the remnant of his army had escaped, and would waste no time in drawing on the reserve manpower of his giant empire. Welcome to our video on Alexander's conquests and the siege of the island city of Tyre. But if you're less about battles of antiquity and more about modern battles with military vehicles, you should check out our sponsor, War Thunder. It's a free multiplayer game on PC, Xbox, and PlayStation in which you control over 2,000 machines of war from the last 100 years for fierce combined arms battles with models from the USSR, USA, Germany, Great Britain, Japan, China, France, Italy, Sweden, and Israel. And it's not just ground vehicles. Support the battle with aerial and naval combat, and do it in style by adding personalized customizations. That of course is on top of all of the practical improvements, loadout choices, and upgradable crew. You'll be fighting in a variety of locations from all over the world, including real-world battlefields, all with different tactical advantages, or even up on high in dedicated aviation battles. And if push comes to shove, there's always the nuclear option. Not much survives this. And remember, it's all free to play. Download War Thunder via our link in the description, and you'll get unique vehicles and 3 days of premium account if you're a new player, and if not, you still get the unique vehicles. Despite a victory at Issus, Alexander couldn't heedlessly chase Darius deep into the Achaemenid heartland now. This wouldn't just draw him into an unknown hostile land and a possible guerrilla war, but would also leave behind potentially fatal issues in his rear. Much of the royal army's massive cavalry contingent had escaped north of the Taurus, where they were sure to wreak havoc on Macedonian supply and communication lines. Of even greater importance still was the Great King's Phoenician armada.
After the death of Memnon, also named, his second-in-command, Pharnabazus, immediately took command of his fleet in the Aegean front. He successfully took Samothrace, Sifnos, and Andros, hindering the delivery of the Macedonian supplies via the sea.
Which, under the command of satrap Pharnabazus, had renewed a campaign in the Aegean and now dominated most of it. So, while Darius began raising another army from his eastern provinces, Alexander decided to continue with his plan to take over Persia's naval bases. A few days of rest after Issus, and the army was on the move once more, pressing south into Phoenicia. Following the surrender of Marathus, Alexander received envoys bearing an offer from Darius III. If Alexander restored to him his wife, mother, and children, signed a treaty of alliance, and called off the invasion, he would cede all Asia Minor west of the Halys River, from Cilicia to Sinope to Macedon. If Philip's old guard, led by Parmenion, caught wind of this offer, they would argue that the invasion had achieved all its objectives. So Alexander omitted the offer of territory during his war council, and the proposal was rejected. It was in response that Alexander penned his famous arrogant rebuttal. "And in the future, let any communication you wish to make with me be addressed to the King of all Asia. Do not write to me as an equal. Everything you possess is now mine."
Damn.
"So if you should want anything, let me know in the proper terms, or I shall take steps to deal with you as a criminal." If, on the other hand, you wish to dispute your throne, stand and fight for it, and do not run away. Wherever you may hide yourself, be sure I shall seek you out." Alexander continued marching south, accepting the surrender of Phoenician cities such as Byblos and Sidon.
This was possibly the reason why Phoenicia was so easy to conquer. Most of its defenders were in the Aegean, with Pharnazabus and Memnon before him, okay?
And the kings of Cyprus. Moving on even further south, the Macedonian army neared the mother city of Carthage, Tyre, at the turn of 332 BC. This most famous of Phoenician cities was composed of two separate segments. Old Tyre was on the mainland, while the primary walled city of New Tyre had been constructed on a rocky island half a mile offshore. As Alexander approached the unique city, he was met by Tyrian dignitaries, among them the son of Tyre's king, Azemilchus, who, along with many other Phoenician rulers, was away at sea with the Persian navy. Their demeanor was respectful and hospitable, offering alliance, provisions, and gifts. However, they were not about to hand Tyre over to the Macedonians. In response, Alexander expressed a desire to offer sacrifice at the Tyrian Great Temple within the island city itself. To allow Alexander to do this would essentially recognize him as Tyre's rightful overlord, so the envoys declined Alexander's request, offering the king to make sacrifice at an equally revered temple in Old Tyre. Alexander exploded in anger, as he sometimes would, and dismissed the envoys with a threat that they should not be so confident in their island fortress, as it would soon be part of the mainland. Once the envoys returned home, they counseled the Tyrians to submit. However, buoyed by their formidable island fortress, its distance from the mainland, and the strength of their natural and constructed fortifications, the city decided to fight. If they hadn't been sure enough that this was the right path, a recently arrived delegation of Carthaginians began encouraging the people of their parent city to defend themselves, promising great reinforcement from their own city, which was a great naval power already. Despite his anger, neither Alexander nor his soldiers were too enthusiastic about besieging the island city with a purely land army, as it would delay the campaign for a long time. The king's temper cooled, and he sent some envoys over the strait in order to urge the people of Tyre to accept peace terms. Possibly mistaking this as a sign of weakness, the Tyrians murdered Alexander's envoys and threw their bodies into the sea. The battle became inevitable. A great portion of the Macedonian officers and soldiers alike were daunted by the staggering task ahead of them. But Alexander, in his typically daring manner, had a plan in his head that just might work. He really would make island Tyre part of the mainland. To enact his scheme, the king had Old Tyre torn down and
Is he making a bridge? I think I remember this.
harvested its stone as raw material. At the same time, parties were dispatched inland to Bekaa Valley, where they fetched timber from the cedar trees on the mountain slopes. To supplement the hardy men of the Macedonian army, entire populations of nearby towns and cities were drafted to serve as a labor corps, which supposedly totaled many tens of thousands strong. Now possessing the material and the men to use it, Alexander began slowly constructing a 200-foot wide mole from the mainland across to Tyre, where it would connect just south of the Sidonian harbor.
Guys, question: what do you think was the mindset of a lot of people, not just in Alexander's time, but kind of any time prior to 1700? What do you think was the mind? Like, if you're someone, like, would you want to participate in a battle, or would you not want to? Like, it was a battle something that, like, young men were like, I mean, what else are you gonna do? You know, it's not like you have the most perfect life. I'm sure there are a lot of problems, and maybe, you know, some excitement of battle might be a drawing force for some young men. I just wonder if it was like a fear thing, or like a, well, what else am I gonna do? That sounds kind of fun. I don't know.
The king's
I just wonder what the enthusiasm level was.
Engineers would sink wooden piles into the mud, pack stone between them to serve as a foundation, and then lay massive timber beams to complete the work. In the muddy terrain and shallow water adjacent to the shore, the going was relatively easy, and the mole's construction got underway with haste. Alexander was constantly present at the forefront of the effort, precisely instructing his workers how to proceed, motivating them with words of encouragement, and even handing out rewards for men who had particularly impressed him with their skill and gusto on the job. The Tyrians, initially believing the mole to be some kind of joke, rode out and mocked Alexander, jeering and asking the king if he thought himself greater than Poseidon. The Macedonian efforts were so disconcertingly effective, and the work was being enacted in such efficient time, however, that the people of Tyre quickly changed their mocking tune.
Wait a second, they're kind of close.
Some of the city's women and children were evacuated by sea. The Tyrian fleet was made ready, and the defenders began constructing extra artillery pieces in anticipation of a proper fight in the very near future. Trouble began for Alexander's besieging army when the mole reached deeper water, taking the construction near missile range. Aiming to stop Alexander's effort in its tracks, Tyre dispatched a squadron of skiffs to each side of the mole. Near unopposed...
That's exactly my thought is, yeah, you're going to be okay near the shoreline, but surely there's going to be a deep depression, it's inevitable, when you have this channel of water in between two pieces of land, it's going to kind of carve out a more deep section. And so I forget how he overcomes this, so let's see.
On the sea, and loaded with missile troops and light catapults, these skirmishing vessels darted in close and unleashed a focused crossfire into the massed labor corps working on the land bridge. The draftees, along with Alexander's soldiers, who worked without their usual armor, suffered terrible casualties in this initial naval sortie and were unable to continue working. To counter this kind of attack, a series of hide and canvas screens were rigged to serve as a barrier against arrow fire, allowing the workers to resume. 2 siege towers were also constructed at the end of the mole to allow Alexander's own missile troops a platform from which to respond. Difficulties now began increasing for both sides, and with that difficulty came superstition. Rumors of ill portents spread, of Macedonian ration bread leaking blood, Tyrian defenders having visions of Apollo, and it is even said a great ocean leviathan smashed into the mole before swimming away again. Next,
guys, that's one thing that's so cool, and I'm almost jealous of people back in the day. Like, imagine how cool it must have been to live in a world where you didn't have a complete world map or anywhere close to near. Obviously, like, if you didn't have a complete world map, you could think like, oh, how cool would it be to live in a time where there was a complete world map? So I get that. Everyone gets their... It's just all of the unknowns must have just... There must have been a mystery about the world that just died when science came around. Or when science has always been a thing. When more serious scientific research came around.
To counter this latest stroke, the Tyrians brought forward a large transport ship and loaded it to the brim with brushwood, pitch, sulfur, and other fiercely burning materials. This fire ship was towed in the mole's direction by a pair of Phoenician triremes, who then at the last moment peeled away and flung the makeshift floating bomb at Alexander's siege bridge like an ancient cruise missile. It struck the edge and burst into an oily, blazing inferno, severely damaging the mole, burning down the towers and killing a great many of the king's troops. At the same time, the Tyrians launched another sortie, this time landing swiftly on the beaches south of the mole and assailing the laborers who were in the process of ferrying stone from Old Tyre. Further inland, Alexander's timber supply from the mountains decreased as well, prompted by the raids by Arab tribes who inhabited the hinterland. Both of the resources needed to forge the strait and gain victory were being choked off. Something had to be done to rectify the situation. After directing his dependable lieutenants Perdiccas and Craterus to rebuild the mole even wider than before, with towers and artillery, Alexander departed with his usual strike force of favourites and rode north to Sidon in search of a fleet. As Arrian tells
My phone's away. That was your guys' fault. Discord.
us, for clearly so As Arrian tells us, for clearly so long as the Tyrians were masters of the sea, the siege of Tyre would be no easy matter. It was during the king's short stay in Sidon that perhaps the greatest strategic bounty of the Issus campaign revealed itself, however delayed it might have been. Having defected from Darius's naval war after the great king's crushing defeat, the Phoenician rulers of Byblos and Aradus pledged their sea-borne strength to Alexander. Together with the Sidonians, that totaled around 80 high-quality vessels with equally high-quality crews. Other scattered vessels sailed.
Hold on, guys. I'm really curious how far away Cyprus is from. Just from like the mainland over here. 69 miles, 70 miles. Okay, that's actually pretty far. Like, how far away is Block Island from Rhode Island? Because I know Block Island is like right at the edge of seeing distance. I'm pretty sure. Like, I think on a very clear day, you can see mainland. Measured distance. Distance to here. Okay, so Cyprus is not close. Okay, I got it.
Sailed from Lycia, Macedon, Rhodes, and other places. More promising still, the kings of Cyprus, seeing which way the wind was blowing, brought 120 ships and added them to Alexander's growing armada a day later. While the burgeoning fleet was being brought up to snuff and armed with artillery, the king ventured out on a punitive expedition into the Bekaa Valley, where he successfully handled the Arab tribes who had been raiding his wood gatherers. Plutarch tells us that during this venture, Alexander snuck up to one of the tribal campfires during the night.
Jeez, this
personally
actually feels like a video game, like campaign mode. Like he just completed a side quest. Like
2 Arab warriors there with a dagger. And personally slew 2 Arab warriors there with a dagger. Upon returning to Sidon, the king not only found the fleet ready for action, but 4,000 additional mercenaries at his command. With his new armada of loyal client kings and reinforcements in tow, Alexander sailed back to Tyre. Initially, the Tyrians arrayed slightly off the city to face the Macedonian attempt at sea, but this giant force was far more than they were prepared for. Wisely, the Tyrian fleet withdrew to the safety of their harbours, which they blockaded with vessels. The balance of power was now firmly on Alexander's side. The Macedonian allied fleet spent the night sheltering near the mole, ready to deploy when the sun came up. As soon as it did, Alexander ordered the Phoenician contingent to blockade Tyre's southern Egyptian harbour, while sending the Cypriots to do the same at the northern.
guys, is any? I'd imagine no. It's just too long of a time, and I bet you sea level has even changed a bit. I'm just wondering if there's any sort of noticeable remnant of this today, and I seriously doubt anything is, because it would just get leveled by water. And okay.
Macedonian harbour, effectively neutralizing and reversing Tyre's previous dominance on
The more I think about it, the more ridiculous it seems. There's just no way.
Macedonian harbour, effectively neutralizing and reversing Tyre's previous dominance on the seas. With that security, work on the mole began apace once more.
Do it.
Unfortunately for Alexander, a ferocious storm began before the mole was set to reach the walls. Rain hammered down from the sky in torrents, gale-force winds blew, and the sea became rough. This turn of luck not only made it impossible to make further progress, but ravaged the existing structure, setting the construction back considerably. To remedy this, the king had a number of massive uncut trees floated into position on the windward side of the mole, where they absorbed most of the impact. When the storm at last subsided, these wave breaks were built into the structure as bulwarks, and the damage was soon repaired and expanded upon, taking the Macedonian bridge into the missile range of the walls. Intent on giving his workmen cover for the final stretch, Alexander massed his available siege catapults and stone throwers on the edge of the mole. Together with the artillery-armed fleet, and supported by archers and slingers, they launched a withering bombardment against the Tyrian battlements, clearing the defenders from the walls. Although under immense pressure, the Tyrians held on with great tenacity, hanging up screens to break the force of Alexander's artillery and building wooden towers on their battlements. From these, Tyre's archers loosed volley after volley of fire arrows at the Macedonian vessels, while the citizens worked at terrific speed to repair any breaches. In some places that wasn't viable, so they constructed a number of secondary curtain walls to plug the gap. At day's end, the situation in the city was dire, but the defences opposite the mole still stood firm. Sailing around to the seaward side of Tyre in the dark of night, Alexander attempted to take the city while it was sleeping, but was foiled only by another short but violent storm and forced to pull back. The Tyrians used this moment of breathing space to scatter large chunks of stone into the shallow water adjacent to the walls, making it incredibly difficult for Macedonian ships to get close. In a desperate maneuver, Tyre's inventors and engineers began devising strange weapons to repel the invaders, including a fire thrower that belched molten metal, barbed tridents, rope-cutting scythes, and even militarized fishing nets to ensnare any Macedonian escalade. This last-ditch attitude was exacerbated by bad news from abroad. 30 more Carthaginian emissaries arrived with words of encouragement, but they regretted to inform their mother city that aid would not in fact be arriving. War at home made that impossible. Alexander spent some time clearing the stones which had been dumped into the water, allowing his ships to once again get close to the walls. At the same time, following a final Herculean burst of industry, the mole stretching all the way from the Phoenician coast to Tyre finally connected. As Alexander had vowed to the envoys of Tyre months earlier, he really had made the island city part of the mainland. The time for a full-scale attack had come. At the advent of midsummer, the Macedonians launched an assault via land from the end of the mole and from the sea on their assault ships. Massive stones launched by catapults smashed into the walls of Tyre, gouging out huge portions of stone and sending it crashing onto the rocks and into the water below. Ballista bolts and archery fire raked the battlements, killing defenders and making others duck for cover. Under the cover of this bombardment, Alexander's infantry used boarding gangways and ladders to attempt an escalade that would finally take the defiant city. They put fierce pressure onto the Tyrians, who fought back ferociously in a conventional manner, but also used their mad inventions to turn the attackers away. Especially mentioned for their effectiveness were a number of metal pots filled with sand and gravel, heated until it was glowing. This fine mixture was then tipped onto Alexander's advancing soldiers, where it sifted behind armor plates and burned into flesh. After a long struggle which yielded no real results except for brutal casualties, the king was once again forced to abandon the effort at nightfall. Dejected and exhausted by the long siege, both he and his companions were about to simply bypass Tyre completely and march on to Egypt. But Alexander held on, if only because giving up now would be costlier than doggedly soldiering on. His persistence was to be rewarded. As they themselves were now in a desperate situation, the Tyrian ships at the Sidonian harbour launched a massive naval sortie completely by surprise. As the crews were at rest, dozens of Macedonian allied Cypriot vessels were sunk in the initial attack, and for a moment it seemed as though the Tyrians were about to make a breakthrough. However, Alexander personally led a squadron of ships from the Egyptian harbour and cut off the overextended Tyrian squadron, destroying almost all of it and bottling the rest up in the harbour, from where they could now do nothing to hinder his efforts. The king's troops and ships followed up this success by first testing an area of wall near the northern harbour, but he was pushed away. From there, his forces turned to assault a section of the Tyrian walls just south of the southern harbour, which Alexander judged to be weak. Artillery let loose once more, and a breach was made. Rather than throwing everything into this action, the king launched a brief probing attack and then withdrew. He was, however, now sure that the Macedonians had found Tyre's soft underbelly. A further few days passed as Alexander rested his men in preparation for the final assault and waited for good weather to return. When the wind and sea quietened down on the third day, the Macedonian army boarded its assault vessels and launched a massive attack on the weakened southern area. Artillery once again hammered the area, collapsing a breach that was then widened even further. Simultaneous attacks were made from the mole and by the fleets on both harbours in order to keep the Tyrians busy. When the main breach was wide enough, the men of the elite Hypaspis brigade and their valiant king strode through, closely followed by mighty Craterus and his battalion of the phalanx and others. As though suddenly realizing their ultimate peril, the defenders of Tyre fought back doggedly, contesting the Macedonians for every step. The fighting was so brutal that Admetus, captain of the Hypaspists, was slain by an axe to the skull. But Alexander's men had done it at last, surmounting the broken walls, taking the battlements, and gaining a firm foothold in the city. At the same time, Phoenician and Cypriot squadrons penetrated both harbours and prompted the retreat of most remaining defenders on the walls to the city centre, lest they be encircled by enemy soldiers. They ran and ran, pursued by the Macedonians, until they reached the shrine of Aganar. There they fought a last stand and died almost to the last man. With the end of organized resistance, chaos broke out. At their king's command, Alexander's soldiers went on the kind of rampage that is so common after long, frustrating sieges. Peter Green paints a picture of the mood and the scene in those hours. All restraint abandoned, hysterical and half crazy after the long rigors of that dreadful siege, mere butchers now, striking and trampling and tearing limb from limb until Tyre became a bloody, reeking abattoir. Only those who took shelter in Melkart's temple were spared. 7,000 soldiers and citizens were butchered in this sack, and a further 2,000 crucified by Alexander when the soldiers' fury died down.
Crucifixion is that old, huh?
The casualty figures would have been far worse had the Sidonians not turned into unlikely heroes. Although entering the conquered, hated city of Tyre on Alexander's side, it is said that they, feeling the plight of their Phoenician cousins, hid 15,000 people and ferried them to safety at Sidon. Tyre, already aflame, was utterly destroyed, and the remainder of its population was sold into slavery. When news of Tyre's end spread, almost every remaining city on the Mediterranean seaboard prepared to surrender, and Darius III, who had been keeping a close eye on the situation, sent even more favorable peace terms. They were denied once more by Alexander, who turned his gaze toward the kingdom of the pharaohs. As he went, time passed and the elements took their course. Gradually, the rough edges and sharp joints of the Macedonian king's infamous mole, which so boldly connected Tyre to the mainland, softened. Sands gathered and winds blew, connecting Tyre permanently to the Asian mainland. Today, as Green tells us, deep under the asphalt streets and apartment blocks, the stone core of that fantastic causeway still stands, one of Alexander's most tangible and permanent legacies to prosperity.
That's crazy.
But the king wasn't finished writing his legacy yet, not even close, and more videos on Alexander's campaigns are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, who...
Awesome video. Kings and Generals, phenomenal. I didn't give a preemptive like. Post-emptive like. Alright, Egypt comes next. That was good. Love it. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you learned something or can teach me something, answer my questions or whatnot. See you guys next time. Bye.